Last week, you will remember, I hope, that we really did our best to address one question, and that question is, who is Jesus? You'll notice the tense of the word, not who was he, but one of the central beliefs of Christianity is that Jesus was a man and that he still is a man because he's still alive. So that's what we looked at, this question. Who is Jesus? We asked as part of that, well, how do we even know that God exists? If Jesus is the Son of God, that implies that there is a God. And I gave a couple reasons for why we can think that there is a God. And one of those is that it's a common human experience to at times feel a sense of loneliness, restlessness, and emptiness. Kind of sense that, like there's nothing in this world that really is going to fill me up and make me happy and make me whole. And we quoted the high culture program Hoarders, this woman whose house was filled with garbage, and she said, I buy things because they fill me up, but then I get empty, and I buy things to fill me up again. And I think if we were all honest, we could kind of see ourselves in that. Maybe we're not hoarders, but I think all of us are a little bit that way. And Augustine, one of the early, called the church, one of the church fathers, was a man from North Africa in the 4th century, and he wrote these words, Lord, you have made us for yourself, and our hearts will find no peace until they rest in you. Now, you might remember we asked this question, how would you describe Christianity in 1 or 2 words? And we saw that the opening words, the first verse of this account of the life of Jesus, it's called Mark, the Gospel of Mark. Mark described Christianity with these 2 words in English, good news. Christianity is all about good news. And by the end, we saw that Jesus, according to Mark at least, has power and authority to teach. He has power and authority over sickness. He has power and authority over nature, power and authority over death. And lastly, that he even has power and authority to forgive sins. So that's kind of a short summary of what we looked at last week. But now I want to ask you this question as we begin this second week where we're going to address this question. Why did Jesus come? If we've gained an understanding of who was he, well, why did he come to this earth? And here's the question I want you to ponder for a moment. Consider this. Would you rather have your eyes opened to an uncomfortable truth or remain blind and live a lie? Ponder that for a moment. Now, you might know what movie I'm going to turn to next. It was from the 1990s, and the movie is called The Matrix. In The Matrix, this lead actor, Neo, Keanu Reeves, he has to make a decision. Do you want the truth, or do you want to go on living this world that's not connected to reality? Do you want to understand this deep reality that is known as what? The Matrix. And so Morpheus has this dialogue with Neo. He says, let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You've felt it your entire life, that there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad. It is this feeling that has brought you to me. Do you know what I'm talking about? And Neo says, the Matrix? Morpheus says, do you want to know what it is? No. Morpheus says, the Matrix is everywhere. It's all around us. Even now in this very room, you can see it when you look out your window or when you turn on your television. You can feel it when you go to work or when you go to church or when you pay your taxes. It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth. And Neo says, what truth? That you are a slave, Neo. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage. Born inside a prison that you cannot smell, taste, or touch, a prison for your mind. Unfortunately, no one can be told what the Matrix is. You have to see it for yourself. This is your last chance. After this, there's no turning back. And in his left hand, he holds out a blue pill. You take the blue pill and the story ends. You wake in your bed and you believe whatever you want to believe. Holds out a red pill in the other hand. You take the red pill and you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. Neo begins to pause for the red pill, and Morpheus says, remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more. So you see the blue pill, the illusion continues, and the red pill is you have to face reality, no matter how ugly it is. And let me ask you kind of a matrixy question. Are you open to the possibility that there is more to reality than you previously thought? Tonight, unfortunately, Jesus is going to give us a very ugly truth about ourselves, about you, about me, about everybody who's ever been born. And the question for us is, are you willing to take the red pill and not the blue pill? Well, tonight, as I say, we're going to address this question. Why did Jesus come? And this is where we're kind of driving. Mark tells us that the main reason Jesus came into the world was to save sinners. So that's in your fill in the blank if you grab that in front of you. And there should be a pen as well. That's what Mark is going to tell us, that Jesus came into the world to save sinners. Jesus came to rescue people who had rebelled against God. If you ask people, why did Jesus come? A lot of people have different answers. They say, well, he came to, give us a good life, give us a happy life. Some people say, well, he came to bring his power and his authority into the political structures of the world. He came to bring social justice into the world and to right every wrong on this earth. Or some people say, look, it wasn't that, but he just came as a teacher to teach us what's good and what's bad, how we should live and how we shouldn't live. Surely that's why Jesus came. Well, there might be elements to that, but what Mark is going to tell us and what Jesus is going to tell us is that the primary reason he came is to save sinners, those who had rebelled against God. So let's turn to Mark chapter 2 in the Bibles in front of you. If you'll grab that, Mark chapter 2, verses 13 through 17. That's on page 995 in the Bibles in front of you. Page 995. Mark chapter 2, verses 13 through 17. Starts out with the word he. Now, he, that's Jesus. He went out again beside the sea, and all the crowd was coming to him, and he was teaching them. And as he passed by, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And Levi rose and followed him. And as he reclined at table in his house, many tax collectors and sinners were reclining with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. And the scribes of the Pharisees, again, these are like the professional religious Jews in Jesus' day. When they saw that he was eating, verse 16, that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, they said to his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And when Jesus heard it, he said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners." Now think with me for a moment. Isn't it the case that if you and I were just to look at the entire globe, all of planet Earth, and let's do our best to kind of divide it up between good people and bad people, wouldn't you think that if God came to Earth and he, divided, here are the good ones, here are the bad ones, and if he's a good God, which people would he want to associate with? Who would he want to be with? Which people? The good people, right? He's like, these are the good ones and I'm good, so these are my people. But you know what? When Jesus came to earth, that was not the group that he went and hung out with. He hung out with the worst sorts of people. Because what Jesus knew and what we're going to see a little bit later this evening is that the reality is that, from one perspective, a lot of us are pretty good people, but that's only when we compare ourselves to others. But compared to God, none of us is good. I mean, now I grant you that's a very high standard, but Jesus understood this. And so therefore, the people that Jesus wanted to be around were the people who understood their true condition, not people who imagined that they were better than other people. Isn't that just the ugliest way that people can be? Have you ever had somebody look down on you, where they look at you and just say, I'm better than you. I don't do that stuff you do. I'm one of the good ones. I mean, that's a horrible attitude. And probably people have treated you that way before. Maybe even you've had that attitude. But it's remarkable that Jesus says, hey, don't criticize me for hanging out people that have a really bad reputation. He says, I didn't come for people who are healthy. I came for people who are what? We're sick. And the reality is I am sick with sin. And so are you. That's what Jesus says. You only go to a doctor when you know there's a problem, not when you're feeling great. So you see, the question for us, it isn't, well, am I good enough? But rather, am I able to admit that I'm bad and that I've done bad things? See, Jesus' assumption is that we are rebels and we need to be healed from something. Now you might say, well, hold on, wait a minute. I don't grant that there's a sin problem. Maybe you just think of sin as like something really bad. A person who hurts other people, who kills people or something like that. Like that's a sin, but I'm not doing that, and the people around me aren't doing that. So I don't really know if there's a sin problem. Well, let me challenge that. I want to gently push back on you a little bit. If you doubt that the world has a sin problem, then ask yourself this question. Isn't it true we've all seen children playing nicely with each other? We've seen married couples totally in love with each other. We've read stories about those who sacrificially serve others. But aren't we just as likely to see children fighting and shouting, hating each other, couples growing to hate each other and getting divorced, and stories about brutal murders and in the news? And here's the question I want you to really deeply ponder is, who taught humans to act that way? You ever thought about that? Who taught people to act that way? I'll never forget, this was probably 20 years ago. This was a church that I attended right after I came to call myself a Christian. And one of the pastors at the church, he had a little daughter who was, 3 or 4 years old. And he said, sometimes, we'll tell her no, she can't have something. And she will like rage and fall on the ground and screaming and shouting, And he asked just a simple question. He said, who taught her to do that? He said, we never taught her to do that. Like, hey, sweetie, when you don't get your way, here's what I want you to do. I want you to freak out, melt down, fall on the ground. So why is she that way? Can we honestly look around the world and say that there isn't a fundamental problem? I don't see how. And contrary to what many people think, educating people does not cause them to live good moral lives. It doesn't. And there are quite a few professors at the University of Georgia here in this church and even in the room right now. And it would be very interesting. I won't put anyone on the spot, but say, tell me about, is it true that the more education, the more moral and ethical you are? I don't even have to ask them. I know they would say, not at all. Is it lack of education that is our problem? That's the next fill in the blank. Is lack of education. Maybe it's because we just don't know the right thing to do. And if we knew the right thing to do, we would be able to do the good thing. Well, I want you to consider this, and this is very grim. But in the 20th century, almost 100 million people were killed in wars alone. Just the 20th century. Up to that point, the most educated century in the history of humanity. That is equivalent to roughly 2,700 people every single day dying for a century. You know what that is? September 11th. The next day, September 11th. The next day, September 11th. September 11th, for 100 years, every single day, in the most educated century in all of human history. Now, it's easy to cast aspersions on the world or on those horrible people who would do those sorts of things. But let's all own up. Isn't there also a problem with us individually? And this is what I mean. We need to realize that we're as much a part of the problem as the solution. Here's a story that I think is pretty funny. Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote Sherlock Holmes, he thought he'd have a little fun. He wrote an anonymous letter to a dozen of his friends. He did not sign it, and all that the letter said was, all is discovered, flee at once. Now imagine you get this letter in the mail. You know what happened? All 12 of them left the city the next day. Now I would think about it. If your spouse or your parent or your boss approached you and said, I know what you did. Isn't it true? You'd be like, oh, shoot, what is it? Which thing that I did am I in deep trouble for? Here's maybe another way to think about it. Imagine you get an invitation to a terrifying party. Because what's going to happen at this party is you're going to invite all your friends, and there's going to be a projector like this, and just kind of like coming up on the screen through all these slides are going to be all of the horrible things that you have thought, or the horrible things that you have done. Can you imagine going to that party? I mean, if that actually happened, I mean, isn't it true, your humiliation of just the things that you've thought about other people? I mean, the horrible things that you thought, the things that you've said, the things that you've done. Can you imagine if that was displayed in a big room full of people you care about? You would flee the country. You would go to like Siberia. Like, I will never see these people again. And that's true for me. It's like, what if your mom knew what you had thought and done? It would be terrifying. All of us were made to reflect God, God's righteousness, his goodness. And that's a part of what it means to be made in the image of God. What it means is that there's something different about you and me, men, women, children, all ethnicities. There's something that is more like God in humans than there is in anything else in all of creation. And God calls my failure and your failure, our failure, to live up to his standards. It's a 3-letter word. It's not very fashionable, but this is exactly what it's called. It calls it sin. That's what sin is. It is rebellion against God. It's rejecting him. And the truth is that we're all guilty. We're all guilty. Let's turn now to Mark chapter 7, verses 18 through 23. That's page 1002. Mark 7. We'll look at this next little section. Page 1002, Mark chapter 7. Look for the big 7 and then go down to the small number 18 below that. Verses 18 through 23. And he, Jesus, said to them, Then are you also without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile him? They were talking about it, how do you wash your hands before you eat, right? That sort of a thing. And then Jesus says, since it enters not his heart, but his stomach, the things that we eat, and is expelled, thus he declared all foods clean. And then Jesus said, what comes out of a person is what defiles him. For from within, out of the heart of man come, look at this list, evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person. You see, it's not our actions that make us unclean, it's our hearts. See, we respond to what's going on in our heart, what's going on into our soul. Those are the things that we live out and that we actualize. And so you see, the problem is just changing our actions, just trying to be nicer. That doesn't fix the root of the problem, because the root of the problem is in here. It's in our hearts. It's deep in our souls. That think of the heart as, I'm not talking about the thing that pumps blood. According to the Bible, the heart would be like the deepest, truest part of you. That's what the heart is. It's like the essence of who you are, is what that means. And the Bible says that our sin, it hurts other people frequently, but the main person who is offended when we sin is, guess who? God. God, because again, he made us to be righteous. He made us to be like him, and I'm not like him the way that I should be. And none of us None of us are. And so the horrible truth is that we're in danger. I mean, Jesus says that those who die in their sins, right? Those who die bearing their own sins, they go to a place called hell. Let me tell you, the way that you grow a church and become really popular today is not talk about hell, right? I mean, who wants to hear about that? Like, you'd have to be crazy to be like, oh, this is great. There's fire and brimstone and all this stuff. But let me ask you this question very soberly. What kind of a monster would I be, or any pastor be, if there really is a place of judgment and I didn't want to tell you about it? I mean, that would be like diabolically evil. And this judgment is what the Bible calls death. That's when, once you die, you are separated from God and you receive his judgment for the things that you've done. Now, we don't like to think about death, right? We just screen it out. It's like, I don't want to think about that. Look, I've got some positive vibes going on in my life, right? Maybe when I'm like 90, I'll think about death, but right now I'm doing okay. Well, we screen it out. And sometimes, how we do it is we cover over it with humor. Okay. So there's a businessman that I respect a lot. And he's kind of respected across the world. His name's Warren Buffett. He's done very well for himself. And at one point, someone asked Warren Buffett what he wanted people to say at his funeral, and he replied, I want them to look at me down in my casket and say, that is the oldest looking corpse I've ever seen. Buffett's like, hey, I'd love to live to be 150, but that's not true. That's not going to happen. It's true that none of us really want to think about death, really. I read a good number of biographies. I really like learning history through reading biographies. And it's fascinating that in all the biographies I read, there's maybe a page or two that's reserved for the death of the person. You read this huge thing about some influential figure, and there's only a page or two that talks about, then he or she died of whatever it is that they died of. Well, get this. This is really remarkable. In the Gospels, over 1/3 of the material is devoted to the last week of Jesus' life and to the account of his death. Why is that? In these 4 letters that were written in the first century, called the Gospels, the 4 accounts of the life of Jesus, about 1/3 of that material is centered on the last week of his life and his death. Why was that? Let me answer it this way. Whenever a baby is born, isn't it true? Whenever a baby is born, parents always have great hopes for this child. Like, this child's going to do great things. Mom, Dad, we're going to do whatever we can so that this child has a great life and makes a positive difference in the world. I mean, that's virtually a universal human experience. But think about this. Jesus was the only person who was ever born to die. I don't think Mary and Joseph, Jesus' parents, thought that way. They saw him like, oh, he's going to die at 30. Oh, this is going to be wonderful. They didn't think that, but that's the reality. That was Jesus' purpose. And so that's what we're going to turn to for the next few minutes, is the death of Jesus Christ and our response to it. And I want you to think with me for a moment. Why is it that the symbol for Christianity, for those who are followers of Jesus Christ, it's not a scroll, it's not a lamp or something like that. It's a cross. That is weird. That's a torture device. Imagine having like an electric chair around or a noose around your neck. You'd be very worried about what's going on with this person. Yet that's the international symbol of Christianity. And in fact, a little bit later, one of Jesus' other followers named Paul, he wrote this: as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. And here's the question I want to ask. Why do Christians proclaim and celebrate the death of their founder? Weird. I mean, I'm a Christian, I'm a pastor, but that's weird. Why is that? Why do we proclaim and celebrate the death of the founder of Christianity when once a month we have the Roman Catholics will call it Mass. We call it the communion or the Lord's Supper. We eat the bread and drink the wine or the grape juice. Well, look at Mark chapter 8, verse 31 on page 1003. And we'll get a little insight into this question. Why is it that we proclaim and celebrate the death of our founder? Starting at verse 31 there. And he, Jesus, began to teach them that the Son of Man, Jesus is talking about himself. That was his favorite title for himself. The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. Oh, wait a minute. Why must? Jesus, you must suffer these things. Why must you suffer and be killed? What was there? Was it like necessary for Jesus to die? Well, in a few pages later in Mark chapter 10, verse 45, Jesus says that's exactly what was necessary. Jesus said, for the Son of Man, Mark 10:45, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. That was Jesus' self-understanding of who he was and why he came to this earth. This word ransom that he uses there in Mark 10:45, it means payment. Jesus is saying that in some sense, my life will be a payment for the lives of other people. How can someone's life pay for another person? For another person's wrongdoings. How is that even possible? Well, you see, Jesus said that in his death, he was actually able to forgive people their sins. That was why he went to the cross, was to rescue and wipe away the stain of their lives. And just think for a moment, all the bad things you've done. I mean, the things I've done, I can't even begin to number them. It's like, imagine, wow, wait, the death of Jesus, the death of a person can just like wipe the slate clean. Yeah, that's the heart of Christianity. Let's look at the crucifixion of Jesus for the next few moments. And I want you to see this. This is on page 1014. So turn a little bit later to Mark chapter 15, page 1014. And I want us to see these things, these three things very briefly. When Jesus was on the cross, number one, God was angry. God was angry when Jesus was on the cross. That's one of your fill in the blanks. Mark 15:33 says this. That Jesus is on the cross. He was arrested on really trumped up charges and was sentenced to death. And he was, at this point, he's hanging on a cross. Verse 33, and when the 6th hour, that's about noon, when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour, until about 3 p.m. See, in the Bible, darkness is a sign of God's displeasure and his wrath and his judgment. Right now on Sunday mornings, I'm preaching through the book of Exodus. And if you know anything about the book of Exodus, God had these plagues, these judgments that he inflicted on Pharaoh and the Egyptians for enslaving the children of Israel. And one of those judgments, you remember what it was? It was darkness. That's exactly right. That's God's way of showing his anger. And why was God angry? What was it that Jesus was taking on himself that caused him to be angry? God is angry over unrighteousness. Do you realize that the God of the universe hates, despises, loathes wickedness? And when Jesus died on the cross, Jesus was actually taking on the punishment that I deserved to receive. And if you trust him, the punishment that you deserve to receive as well. What would you think about a judge, not God, but just a human judge, who someone was brought to trial for committing some horrible crime, and the judge knew it, everybody knew that the person did it. Like, no question, DNA, 100% they did it. And the judge is like, well, we're not really going to worry about that. I'm going to be a loving judge. Would that be a good judge? That would be a wicked judge, to just like look the other way, like, well, we'll sweep that mass murderer under the rug. It's not a big deal. And if we would just think with disgust on a judge like that, imagine the God of the universe just looking the other way at all of the evil in this world. Have you ever been Have you ever been hurt by sin and angry at God, and you say, God, if you're really good, if you're really out there, why don't you do something about this? Like, this thing is wicked. This is evil. And in my experience, I have yet to meet someone who doesn't believe in God, who didn't have the following happen. There was something horrible that happened that they experienced, that they saw, and that they witnessed, and they turned away from believing. They said, I used to believe in God, but I can't believe in a good God anymore. And so therefore, I don't believe in God. In my experience, it has been every atheist I've ever met. There was something horrible that happened. And they said, I can no longer believe in a good God because he's not doing anything about evil folks. On the cross, God was doing something about evil and injustice. On the cross is where his fury, I'm using that word intentionally, God's fury toward evil was poured out on his own son. So God has done something about evil and injustice. The judgment on Jesus, we might say, was not the last judgment. There will be more fury and more wrath that he pours out. And I don't care what wickedness has been done to any of you. God will judge evil. And that's what the darkness across the land means. God is doing something about evil and injustice. Secondly, Jesus was abandoned on the cross. Look at this in verse 34. And at the ninth hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? See, Jesus was experiencing spiritual agony, we might say. He had never received a frown from his heavenly Father, much less the judgment of God the Father. But he did when he was on the cross. He'd never been separated from that closeness with his Father, but now he was experiencing it. And yet, according to Jesus, here's what's crazy. According to Jesus, and according to everybody who knew him, he had never done anything wrong. He had never sinned. This is what probably his best friend said, his name was Peter. This is what Peter said about Jesus in 1 Peter 2. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. Listen to this. And imagine, who's your best friend? Just think of their name, his or her name. Would they say this about you? He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. My best friend would not be able to say that about me. Could your spouse say that about you? Of course not. None of us. None of us. I mean, have you ever been to kind of an awkward funeral eulogy where like the spouse or the child gets up and is like, oh, dad just never did anything wrong. Mom was wonderful. She loved us perfectly, and the family is like, pretty nice, but I mean, I have some stories, Jesus never wronged anyone. And so whose sin was he paying for? He was paying for the sins of those that he loved, paying for the sins of his people. The Bible defines sin, this word sin, as living as if something other than the true God is your God, right? Another way to maybe think about sin is, this is a little bit crass, but I'm going to say it. Sin is giving the middle finger to God. Saying, God, forget you. I don't need you. I rule my own life. I am king over my own life. I'm God over my own life. That's the definition of sin. And what judgment means is that if throughout your life you just say, no, thank you, no, thank you, no, thank you. Sorry, God, I don't need you. No, thank you. No, thank you. No, I'm good. I'm fine. Don't need you. That eventually, when you die, God will say, okay, you don't want me? You're not going to have me forever. That's what God's judgment is. The good news is, the gospel is that Jesus paid the price so that we don't have to. And thirdly, Jesus enabled us to be accepted by God. Still in Mark 15, verse 37, Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. What's the connection between these two events? Jesus breathing his last breath and the curtain being torn in two. This curtain, it was about 30 feet high, is our best guess, and it was about, kind of the width of your hand, this thick thing that separated this place where people would go to worship and the priest would offer these sacrifices. Separated that room from this room where God was said to dwell in the Holy of Holies. And it's like, imagine just this curtain ripping in half. That was what the death of Jesus affected. And what does that mean? What does that tell us about the death of Jesus? It tells us that the way to God is now open. The way to God is now open, and people are able to come into God's presence because sin has finally been dealt with. Well, the question for us, if we've seen now, why did Jesus come? The question that I'm going to close with in the next couple minutes is how should we respond? How should we respond? How will we react? Well, here's a few possible reactions we could have. One is the busy soldiers. You notice the soldiers here in verse 22 of Mark 15. That's page 1014. And they brought him to the place, that is Jesus, brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him and divided his garments among them, casting lots for them to decide what each should take. This was, of course, as they were crucifying Jesus. And they're too busy to even notice or to care about who it was that they were crucifying. It's like, look, I got a job to do, right? I've got bills to pay. I've got pressure. My family, got some other things I want to do in life. I'm just not interested. Not interested, Jesus, and responding to you in a way that's appropriate. I'm just doing my job, as a soldier. Another way to respond would be the self-satisfied righteous. We could say the self-righteous religious. Verse 31 in Mark 15, as Jesus is on the cross, so also the chief priests and the scribes mocked him to one another, saying, he saved others, he cannot save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross that we may see and believe. Does it surprise you that it's the religious people who were on bad terms with God? I mean, that's the way it was pretty much if you read through the Gospels. It's those who think that they've got it together say, Jesus, I don't need you. I'm fine. Like my efforts, my energy, that's really all that I need. And I'm good. I can do it on my own. Thanks for the offer, but I don't really need you, Jesus, because I'm not perfect, but I'm a good person. Like my good definitely outweighs my bad, so I'm cool. I don't need you. And the last way that we could respond is according to the way the Roman centurion did. Right after Jesus died in chapter 15, verse 39, the curtain rips that I just explained a moment ago in verse 38. And verse 39, and when the centurion who had stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, truly, this man was the Son of God. I mean, you talk about a tough guy. These Roman soldiers, they're professional executors. It's like they went to college to learn how to kill people in the most brutal and heartless ways. And look at his response to Jesus. Like, wow, wait, I don't think this was just some ordinary man. I think this actually was God that we just killed. Isn't it interesting? Isn't it interesting that this Roman soldier was echoing what Mark told us at the very beginning? Mark said he was writing to tell us the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And here at the end, the Roman centurion says, truly, this was the who? The Son of God. So it's kind of a red pill, blue pill moment. Are you willing to listen to Jesus? I mean, by all accounts, at the very least, the most influential or one of the most influential lives that has ever been lived. Are you willing to take the red pill and consider? Remember, I opened with, would you rather have your eyes open to an uncomfortable truth or remain blind and live a lie? Well, that's our aim in this class for this week. And then when you come back next week, we're going to continue just listening to Jesus and and doing our best to assess who was he. We want to get to the truth about him. And how will we respond? I'm too busy, or oh, I'm doing fine, I don't need any help, or maybe the Roman centurion. Which response will be? All right, well, I'm happy now to answer any questions. And before we do, let me give you some encouraging news. Tonight's lesson was the longest one, far and away. So next week, we're going to talk about grace. What does that word mean? We'll focus on that. But again, we're over the hump because this was the longest one, and the others will be shorter from now on. So I'm happy to take any questions that you have, and I'll do my best to answer. I didn't eat my cookie, so I can nibble while y'all are talking. Anybody online? Any questions from folks online? Got a handful involved? Let me just say again, I'm so glad y'all are here. I really am. I'm just very honored by your presence here, and I hope that these that tonight and last week have been helpful to you, and I hope these next few weeks will be helpful as well. And I'm here to serve this community. I'm here to serve each of you. So at any point, reach out to me, drop by church, give me a call, and that's why I'm here, and that's what I love doing in life. It's getting to know people and urging people to have a closer relationship with God. If all this stuff is true about Jesus that we've seen and that we're going to see, this is the most important thing in the world. Nothing even comes close. So thank you all so much for being here, and I hope to see you all next week. Okay, thanks.